Well, hi there. So in this video, we're going to do our first lecture about oligopoly. There's not a whole lot for us to actually kind of get from this. Most of what we're actually going to be doing with oligopoly involves game theory, which we'll get to in the second lecture. So the basics of oligopoly are first, that there's a small number of firms, less than 10. And second, and this is the key trait, right, is that they are interdependent. Because there's so few firms, their profit, their outcome is dependent on what the other firms are doing, and vice versa. Every firm's outcomes and decisions is actually dependent on what the other firms are doing. Now, we can determine whether we're in an oligopoly by kind of just eyeballing it and saying, less than 10 firms or so. But really, there's actually two measures of market power or concentration that governments use to determine whether something's an oligopoly. The first and easier one is called the four-firm concentration ratio. This is just adding up the four largest market shares. So we often say that if there's more than 50%, it's pretty oligopolistic. If it's more than 90, it definitely is. So if we had a market with, say, 25%, another firm with 20%, another with 20%, another firm with 15%, and then all the rest was the rest, we could sum these and say, well, that's 80% is the market share for those four largest, and so that's probably pretty oligopolistic. Now, this is kind of a blunt instrument. It doesn't allow us to really easily determine the differences between different types of oligopolies. For example, if you had a four-firm market share with only two firms of 50%, 50%, well, then their four-firm ratio would be 100, and that would just tell you, well, there's 100% of the market in two companies. If you had another with 99% and 1%, well, it still ends up being 100. And so you can't really tell the difference between different types of oligopolies. That's where the Herfindahl-Hirschman index comes in. The Herfindahl-Hirschman index is actually the most common legal measure of concentration. It squares the market shares and then adds those. So for example, if you had 30%, 30%, 20%, 20%, you would square those values, 30 squared, 30 squared, 20 squared, 20 squared, and you would find an HHI value. The way we interpret these is if the HHI is less than 1,500, it's not an oligopoly. 15 to 25 is definitely so, and we want to look at them. Above 2,500 is definitely an oligopoly, and typically governments don't approve those mergers. So in this example up here, we can actually tell the difference. 50 squared plus 50 squared is 2,500 plus 2,500. That's 5,000. 99 squared is 9,801. Whoops, 99 squared. And 1 squared is 1, so that's 9,802. So the HHIs are radically different for these two markets, and you could actually see that this one is darn close to the actually theoretical maximum. If there's only one firm in the market, what would that be? Well, 100 squared equals 10,000. So that's a monopoly. That's not what we have up here, but it's darn close. And you can see that that's way different from a firm with 150%, another firm with 50%. Now, firms are going to avoid competing with each other as much as possible in oligopolies. There's three ways that they do that. One is by trying to form cartels or trusts. That's a formal agreement where they actually determine an agreement to restrict their output and raise prices. It's illegal in the United States, but it's also relatively common because it's really hard to detect. B is informal collusion. This is called using game theory to basically study what's the strategic behavior that's in our best interest. And it's a little bit more complicated than I can explain here in about 2 minutes. But basically, there are ways that they can silently collude with each other. For example, if you have a market with two different firms, and one with, say, 60% of the market and another with 40% of the market, and the one with 60% one day raises their prices. Well, the firm that has 40% of the market, they could sit there and think about it for a little bit, and they go, if I raise my prices too, we stay with the same number of customers, but we both make more money. And so they don't have to actually talk to each other at all. The smaller firm just watches the bigger firm, and when the bigger firm raises its price, the smaller firm does too. Another way to think about it, you have two airlines that fly to the same airport. If one of them says, you know what, we're going to focus on leisure travelers to this airport, and the other one can go, they're focusing on leisure travelers, we could focus on business travelers. And if they stay out of each other's way, they don't even have to talk to each other about that. They could just basically avoid competing with each other. And so that's a way that they basically can collude, but without actually restricting output in a very specific way. A third way that they often try to avoid competition is through product differentiation. It's basically a way of making it difficult or expensive or encouraging customers to not switch from one company to another. When you've made your product really differentiated, what you're really trying to do is make it as unique as possible so that your customers don't switch to the other people. So if they have a lot of product differentiation, they're effectively carving up the market into little slices, and each of them gets to be their own little monopolist within that particular demographic of the market. So that's a lot of times where they use things like warranties and amenities, brand loyalty, miles, all those kinds of programs, is again to try to carve up the market into smaller slices and avoid competing with each other. So hopefully this helps you understand the basics of oligopoly. I'll see you next time.